Testing, 1, 2, 3. Testing, 1, 2, 3. All right. So in the first episode of So You Bought a Fish Tank Water, we started talking about some of the science, some of the processes that go on in your fish tank. Hey Laura, thanks. Welcome to the stream. We started talking about some of the scientific processes that go on inside of a fish tank. These are nature. It's natural. Hey HC Aqua, welcome to the stream. These are natural processes. The nitrosoma and nitrobacter bacteria that live in our fish tanks are in the air. They're on almost every object that we could touch, and once they get inside of our fish tank, and once they begin to set up shop, set up colonies, and begin to process the ammonias, the hey Joel, welcome to the stream. Once they set up shop in colonies and start processing through the nitrites, the ammonias, they will even break down chlorine into ammonias. They're doing this in a completely natural way that is what goes on in nature. If you go out into the wild, including the creek behind your house, you are going to find these same bacteria at work in that creek, breaking down. Hey Joseph, welcome to the stream, man. Glad to have you aboard, man. Joseph, what I'm basically doing with these streams is I'm trying to welcome new fish keepers into the hobby, and it is my hope to give them as much anecdotal and information as possible to hopefully not confuse them, but hopefully to give them a way to start learning about this hobby and how to keep their fish so they don't go through the hey Candy, welcome to the stream. Candy, I don't know why you don't have a wrench, but we can fix that. It's fundamentally critical that people that want to go from just having goldfish in a goldfish bowl until they die and then get more goldfish and put back in the bowl again, anyone that wants to expand their hobby into actual fish keeping needs to begin to understand and assimilate the information that is pertinent to water in their fish tanks. These scientific processes, the nitrogen cycle, pH, TDS, water testing for the qualities for the nitrate, nitrite, ammonia, levels in water for the heavy metals in water. All of these things go together to give the new fish keeper a better understanding of the water that is in their tank and what they need to do. The process of testing water, the process of testing TDS, the process of observing the water in our fish tanks is critical to how our fish will survive or thrive or eventually be able to breed and create new life. It all of these things go hand in hand towards keeping our fish alive. And so it's really important. Hey, Kevin Hyatt, welcome to the stream, man. It's really important that new fish keepers gain a certain amount of familiarity with the sciences that are involved in the water in our fish tank. And one of the things that rarely gets discussed very much, and I've noticed this in all fish keeping videos, one of the things that gets glossed over and not talked about, that is also extremely critical to our fish and the water, is the osmotic process that our fish go through. Fish take in the water through their gills and they expel wastes, they expel urea, they expel extra ions that they don't need, of salt and of other minerals. They build up a certain amount of these inside their body in order to deal with the pressures, the osmotic pressures of the water chemistry outside of their body. And they also take water in through their skin. Their skin is a semi-permeable membrane, like an RO membrane, and it allows a certain amount of water and ions, minerals, into their body, and thereby allows a certain amount out. So it's critical for their well-being that they are easily able to expel unwanted salts, unwanted minerals, built up, I'm not sure what the fish equivalent of lactic acid is, but I'm sure there is one of some sort. Someone that's deeper in the science might be able to explain that better. But their body processes the waste and the minerals that it is dealing with through osmotic regulation, letting water pass through the semi-permeable membrane of their skin and then back out carrying certain amounts of these waste products away from their body, certain amounts of these built up salts away from their body, and it goes into the water. And we need, as fish keepers, to be able to keep that water on an even keel so that we don't disturb their osmotic processes too badly, so that the buildup in the water doesn't cause them to go into some kind of survival mode because there's so many poisonous or mineralized particulate in the water that they can't regulate it by their normal osmotic process, and they have to keep changing how their body is in relationship to this water that is outside of them, in the sense of how those osmotic processes go on. And this is a lot of deep science. It's a lot of stuff I don't even know. I've already told you more than I know. but it is yet again another part of the scientific side of fish keeping that it is really fundamental for fish keepers to understand and to take into account when they are dealing with the water in their fish tank. Not the fish, the water in their fish tank. And as fish keepers, That is our biggest responsibility. Yes, we have to feed our fish. Yes, we have to observe our fish. Yes, we have to do our research before we even get fish. But it is of critical importance all the time that we understand as much as we can, and this is a slow process that builds over many years, as much as we can, the sciences that are in effect in our fish tank and causing the water around them to be what it is for them to live in. And there are lots of them. Um, the nitrogen cycle, the, the TDS, the total dissolved solids in water, the pH of the water, whether it's base or acid, acidic, the nitrate levels, the nitrite levels, the ammonia levels. All of these things go hand in hand to show us a picture of what the water in our tank is like, so that we know, wait a minute, this 90 ppm I'm getting on my nitrate reading is bad. There's way too many nitrates in this water, and I need to do a very large water change to try to break this down so that there are not so many nitrates for my fish, poor fish, to be dealing with. Yes, fish can survive high nitrates in water, and some of them can even survive over a long period of time. But it is continually degrading the well-being of those fishes. It is continually breaking down their bodies through the changes they're having to go through on their osmotic processes, on the changes they're having to go through on expelling waste through their normal gill function. It is a bad situation for the fish. And the only way to get rid of nitrates is by doing water changes or by having a heavy enough plant load in a tank that it is absorbing as much of that nitrate as possible, because there are no longer bacteria functioning to break down nitrates. And I think I've finally got that correct now. I messed up in the last episode on nitrite and nitrate. Nitrite is very deadly to fish in even small amounts. But once the nitrosoma bacteria break down that nitrate and turn it into nitrite and turn it into nitrate, it is much less harmful. It's still harmful. It's still something we need to, as fish keepers, get out of the environment which our fish live in. And the only way to do that are those two things. I mean, there are other caveats in the sense that you can put nitrate absorbing materials into the tank that will chelate that nitrate out of the water. But those are emergency stopgaps. Those are ways to ship fish and keep them alive, even though they're in a small amount of water for sometimes an extended period of time. Those are the kinds of things, if you use a nitrate sponge just to keep your tank on a normal keel, you're probably doing something wrong. You probably have some issue in your fish tank that is causing you to have a continually high amount of nitrates in your water. It may be your tap. Your tap water may be coming in at high nitrate levels. And I'm 64, and I've been keeping fish since the early 70s. Not as a good fish keeper, but keeping fish nonetheless. And I have done a lot of research trying to figure out what's going on in my fish tanks, why fish die. There's very little that I despise more than me making mistakes which caused my fish to die. I feel highly insulted by my own inability in that situation. I feel like it is my fault, that I should have understood better what was going on to avoid this, that I should have reacted quicker, that I should have observed more closely, that I should have done my research more diligently so that I could avoid losing fish. Now, if you are a fish keeper for any length of time, and I mean a real fish keeper, someone that really goes after it, you are going to lose fish. There's no two ways about it. Fish don't have that long a lifespan. So some of them do. Some of them can, you can get bikers that live in 20 years, and you can get koi that live forever, longer than their owners do. But I have always railed against my own failings and tried my best to use each fish death as a way for me as an opportunity for me to learn to better keep my fish. Case in point, a lot of you that have followed my channel know that Corey McElroy, Dean Tweedale, Joseph Harden, who's in this chat, we went to Peru on a Go Wild trip, and that's what these pictures are in the background. And we lost a ton of fish on them being shipped back in. They got held up in an airport. They sat on the concrete for 3 days or 2 days, and most of our fish died. A good 40 to 50% of the fish died. And especially the ones I wanted to keep so desperately, which were the green gold plecos. Michael Barber, out of the goodness of his heart, sent us, Joseph and myself, more of the Titicharox tetras, the blue tetras, that we also fell in love with. And upon putting them in my 55-gallon tank that I had set up for these fish, over a period of 4 or 5 days, I lost all of them but one. I had about 16 fish when they finally, I finally figured out how many had survived the shipping and how many had survived in my tank. I had about 16 of them. And they died over a period of about 3 days. And I honestly think if it wasn't something that hurt them in shipping, because a bunch of them died in shipping, maybe 9 of them died in shipping, then it was my setup of that 55-gallon tank that caused those fish to die. Something that I had in the water, something about how I had that tank set up, was deadly to those fish over a period of 3 or 4 days. I have one left. And Joseph has done some research and decided that some of the Titiocharax that we got were not Tambopanesis, that were another variety. And I think the one that survived is that, what is it, Melani? Melani, Joseph? I think that those fish were not the Tambopanesis. They were a different variety. And I think I already had 3 of those kind in my tank from the original shipment that had done fairly well. You know, that's why it was kind of a mystery to me that those other fish I'm so happy for you, Joseph. I really am. 40 plus just rocks. I'm really proud of you, man, that you managed to breed them, and that I failed so badly. But I think my failure had as much to do with how much water flow I had in that tank. I set that tank up for the plecos that we caught in really fast flowing little rivers and streams. And so I set my 55-gallon up to have a high flow in it. I wanted a lot of water turnover and a lot of high flow for those plecos, because that's what I wanted most of all. Yeah, hopefully one day, Candy, Joseph can send me some. And maybe by then I'll have another fish tank with nice slow water. I had my 30-gallon long that I put my my cichlids that we brought back in, but those little tiny Titiocharex would just be a morsel for those cichlids to eat. So I didn't dare put them in that tank. And it's much slower. There's only a sponge filter and a hang-on back filter on that tank. So the water flow in that tank is much, much less. And I think that they would probably survive in that tank. T. Madeirae. Madeirae. Okay, I've been saying Melani, but I see what you're calling it. And I think that's what I have. I think I now have 4 of those in my tank with a bunch of Nigrocinctus and the plecos that I have. And I think I have 2 different types of plecos in my tank. And it may be that one's female and 2 are male, or 2 are female and 1 is male, but we really didn't get much information about the oddball plecos that we caught for me to actually nail down exactly what I think I've got. So I really haven't done that yet. I'm trying to grow them out more. And those fish are all doing fine in that tank. I haven't had breeding yet that I'm aware of, but those fish are doing fine. They're not having any trouble surviving. In fact, they're getting fat and sassy. And I'm getting off track here, but my point is that as fish keepers, we have to decide for our fish. Yeah, leaf litter. I put plenty of leaf litter in my 55, Joseph, but the plecos ate it. As soon as they got in there, they started eating all those leaves. So now all I have is little skeletons of leaves that I haven't pulled out of there yet, the ones I haven't gotten out. And live foods is probably true. Floating plants, yes, I definitely think those are critical for those fish to breed and for them to feel more comfortable. We caught them in usually slow, kind of green water situations that were mostly, in my experience of catching them, were mostly up against banks that had overhanging vegetation. Several of the places that we caught them, and I think we caught them in 3 different places, or maybe it was just 2. But where I caught them the most at, and I probably caught 30 of them in just standing on the bank, shooting my net into a deep hole and pulling it back up. But it's incumbent on us as fish keepers to realize that the choices that we make about setting our tanks up. AKG, welcome to the stream, man. Um, our initial choices about how we set up our tanks, what substrate we use, what decorations we use, what plants we put in the tank, what filtration we put in the tank, how much water flow, what pH we keep the water at, what TDS we keep the water at, what everything. Yeah, it sure does, Joseph. I know I've pretty much worn out all these pictures. I've showed them over and over and over, probably 40 or 50 live streams. I've used this as a background. But the thing I like about it so much is that no matter what thumbnail it makes, when the live stream makes a thumbnail, it always seems to be a new picture. I mean, there's about 400 pictures here that I've taken. Some of them are not that good. Yeah, well, they're less than a year old. They're coming up on a year old. Doesn't seem like it's that long ago that we went. At times, I still feel like I'm there. Okay, we're getting completely far afield of what I'm trying to do here, which is to find some way to make it easier for new fish keepers to grasp the basic fundamentals of what's required to watch the water in our fish tanks, to learn to observe what's going on with the water in our fish tanks so that we can adjust it if needed, or we can change it if needed, or we can do things to try to ameliorate some issue that's in the water. And to that end, I have chosen water as the first subject because I think it's the most critical, and it's one that new fish keepers have the most trouble with, whether they realize it or not. They go and they buy a fish, and then the store says, well, you need a tank this size for that fish. And they buy the tank and they say, well, if you're going to have a tank this size, you need this for a filter. And go pick out some gravel to put on the bottom, and here's some fake plants you can put in there. And they take all of that home, and they fill the tank with water, and they drop their fish in, and the fish may survive that night, but usually by morning they're showing signs of distress, and they don't often live more than a week or two because the whole nitrogen cycle is occurring after they've been put in the tank, not before. And so they have to go through the low oxygen environment of a nitrobacter bloom, which turns the water to milk. And it's just not a healthy environment for fish to survive in. Now, once that bloom dies back and the water clears up again, then you can add your fish. There are enough bacteria in that tank working to deal with the load that is in that tank. And if you add a couple of fish, then more bacteria will come online to deal with the added load of fish respiring and defecating in the tank, and the bacteria will rise to how much food there is in the tank for it to process. So to me, what a new fish keeper needs to do is to take all of that tank and all of the accoutrement and take it home and leave the fish at the fish store and set the tank up, get the tank running, feed the tank a little bit, and allow that tank to cycle. Allow that nitrogen cycle to commence, to bloom into the water, and to establish that tank as a mature tank that the fish can then be added to. And there are lots of different ways of doing it. You can add the starter kits of bacteria when you first put the water in the tank. You can squeeze out an old sponge filter that's been in a mature tank into that tank. Although the one downside of that process, and it's one that many of us use, is that by taking a sponge filter out of another tank and squeezing it out into your new tank, you are indeed adding pathogens, potential diseases, potential parasites into this new tank. Now, if that new tank stays empty of fish for a certain period of time, like 2 weeks, then most of the parasites that are in that tank will die because they can't run through their cycle of inhabiting a fish, of making new parasites, and then those parasites becoming free swimming, and then back into the fish again and completing the parasite cycle. By not having fish in that tank for 14 days is what I've always been told, that you can essentially kill off the parasites that are in the tank. Now, some might survive. You just never know sometimes. But that's the one downside of using a sponge filter to cycle a new tank. And I do it every time. Every time I start a new tank, I will dump a sponge filter or two into that tank and squeeze them out until the water's just muck, and then let that muck settle and cycle into the filters, whatever filtration I've got in that tank, whether it's another sponge filter, whether it's a sponge filter and a hang-on back, whether it's a canister filter. I let that stuff cycle through. Then I will feed the tank a little bit. You know, just throw a few flakes of flake food in the tank, and that will break down and give the bacteria something to eat, something to function on, and you can cycle a tank that way. But cycling a tank is probably the first mistake that most new fish keepers make, and that causes them to lose whatever fish they've brought home. Now, there are lots of other mistakes that they can make, but if you go to a mom and pop store and tell them that you are a new fish keeper, that you've fallen in love with this fish in their store, that you want to keep it, and you want to have a tank at home to keep it in, and that you don't have any knowledge or experience of fish keeping, most mom and pop local fish stores will walk you through these processes. But if you go to a big box store, and that may be all that you have in your local area, and your kids want a fish, and you just go through the process of getting what the store person tells you that you need, and take it home and set it up and plop the fish in, then you're probably not going to get the best advice about how to make this experience one that you want to do again. Because spending $50 on fish and $150 on tanks and equipment, and taking it all home and setting it up and watch the $50 worth of fish die over a period of a week or two is not the kind of experience that you're going to want to do again. And as fish keepers that have been in the hobby for a long time, I think it's really incumbent on us to try to help new fish keepers avoid these situations, avoid the kind of experiences that can knock you out of this hobby before you really ever get started. And the main one, in my thinking, is water. That is the main issue that most new fish keepers deal with, that causes them no end of problems because they don't have a grasp on the sciences or what's going on in the tank. They say, my tank is all milky and my fish are dying. What can I do? And of course you say, well, do a 50% water change. But what that does is just take half of the algae, the bacteria bloom out of the tank, and then it continues blooming when you've done that water change. Now, it may keep your fish alive. That water change may be just enough to keep your fish from dying, but they're probably going to be gill burnt. They're probably, some of them are going to be blinded in eyes. There are a lot of things that happen during a bacteria bloom, a full bacteria bloom, where the water literally looks like milk in a tank. Before that bacteria has bloomed to the height of its population and then died back and the water clears again, there's going to be a lot of issues with fish that go through that process. And most of them are not going to survive, which is why I think it's incumbent on us as people who have been through these experiences, who even experience these things today. We can all make mistakes. We can all do things that cause our fish to go through this same process. If you have a power outage in your house and all of your canister filters stop running, it only takes about an hour for all that bacteria in those canister filters to die, not having water flowing through it. And we can very easily have a secondary bacteria bloom when the power comes back on and those power filters come back on. It can cause a secondary bacteria bloom in our 20-year-old fish tanks. And this is the kind of thing that we are continuously dealing with throughout the whole of our fish keeping lives. We're always going to be right on the edge of a serious issue that could cost our fish their lives. Now, that doesn't mean that after a certain point you don't get to a place where, with most problems, you know what to do and you know how to deal with it and you know how to catch it early enough to where it doesn't become a really serious issue. It just starts to become an issue and you deal with it automatically because you know. You don't have to think about the science. You don't have to get the book out and go through every step of the nitrogen cycle again. These things become second nature to fish keepers after a long period of time, and we just instinctively know what's going on when we look at a test kit reading, or we look at how our fish are behaving, or we look at what the water is acting like, or we look at how our plants are acting because of how the water is interacting with them and they are interacting with the water. It becomes second nature after many years, so that we don't have to restart our learning of the sciences immediately when we have an issue, because most of this stuff has become second nature to us. Now, that has its own issues, because by letting it become second nature instead of keeping it in the forefront all the time, sometimes we let things slip because we don't catch something in time, or we don't recognize what's actually going on. So this is a continual battle that fish keepers from 10 to 90 are dealing with all of the time. And it's just incumbent on new people to recognize that this is something that they need to be aware of and try their best to become accustomed to and to recognize what's going on. I mean, it's not rocket science. It's not a science that is so difficult that it can't be absorbed in, experiences over a year or two. You will begin to absorb it. It will become second nature to you. But it is critical to your fish that you are able to wield that knowledge and keep them safe and keep them thriving and keep them in conditions where they can breed. If you were to ask Joseph about it, he would tell you he rarely thinks about that stuff anymore. He just does what he knows is right. And that's the way it becomes. But you have to get to that point. You have to get to the point where you are fundamentally sound enough on the basic water chemistry of a fish tank and the natural processes that are going on in that fish tank so that you begin to be able to keep water. And then you can keep fish because you are keeping that water well enough for fish to thrive in. And I guess that's enough for me ranting on water. I'm saying the same thing over basically. But, redundancy is something that new fish keepers need. They need to hear the same things over and over and over again so that it becomes second nature to them, so that they begin to absorb it in such a way that when they're faced with an issue, a light bulb goes on in their head and they say, oh, this is what they were talking about. This is why I need to understand that. And this is what I need to do to rectify the situation. Or I've got this situation, what do I need to do about it? And go out and find someone that can answer that question. Because sometimes in this hobby, the most important thing is asking the right question. People can give you all kinds of anecdotal and encyclopedic information, but sometimes you need to be able to ask the correct question so that the responses that you get actually help you through your situation. And if you don't know the first thing about the scientific processes, the natural processes that are going on in your fish tank to begin with, people are going to ask you, what's your pH? Or they're going to ask you, what's your nitrate levels? Or they're going to ask you, what's your TDS in that water? And you're not going to even know how to give them that answer, because a lot of times those answers are critical for that person to give you good information about what you need to do. So half the battle in being a fish keeper is to know what question to ask and to know what information is required for that question to be answered. Time and time again on Corey's videos, and Corey gets an awful lot of new fish keepers, and I'm really proud of him for that and proud of the efforts that he goes through to try to give those people a leg up on understanding how to be good customers for him, because people that come away with a bad experience on their first fish keeping go, they're not going to be repeat customers. They're not going to be people buying ICX in 2 years. They're going to be out of the hobby. That fish tank and all the plastic plants and the clown puke gravel is going to be sitting in the garage gathering dust, and they will be completely out of the fish keeping part of this hobby and never want to come back again. They will say, ugh, I hate this. I hate going through this. I hated watching those fish die. I hated my kids screaming and yelling because their fish were dying every day. So on the business side of things, it's important. On the personal side of things, me knowing that so many people are going to go out there and kill all these fish they just bought, that just grinds on me. And I want to try as best I can to help them not do that. And to that end, I have tried to break down, so you just bought a fish tank, new fish keeper, into areas that I think are critical for new fish keepers to understand. And the first one that we've done is water. And while we probably have not covered it well enough, while the questions probably haven't all been answered, I think we've driven deeply enough into it that people will begin to understand what it is they need to search for, what kind of questions they need to ask the salesperson. And believe me, if you go into a big box store and you ask the salesperson to explain the nitrogen cycle to you, and the salesperson just rolls their eyes and goes on to a different subject, my first piece of advice would be to get the hell out of there and don't buy from someone who can't even begin to explain to you what's required to keep fish alive. Now, I understand you may be in a place where that's the only option that you have, is to deal with that big box store or to deal with that Walmart's or wherever it is that your kids are telling you they want to buy these fish from. But it's incumbent on you as a new fish keeper, if you are dealt that hand, if that is the only place that you have that you can go get fish from, and they don't have any good advice for you, then it's incumbent on you, in my opinion, to spend less of that money on plastic plants and treasure chest bubble wands, and more of that money on books that are beginner's guides, on books that are intermediate guides, on magazines that are about fish, on surfing the internet so that you can find information about the questions that you are really trying to ask, about the things that you need answers to. Okay, that's going to be a wrap from me on water. There are thousands of other pieces of information that are quite needed in this topic, but I think that that is a fundamental opening of the subject. I will take questions from anyone that watches these videos and has questions, and I will do my best to answer those, either in the live chats or in the below the video after the video comes out. I'm going to start doing some regular videos about this subject as well. My wife and I have been going through some pretty serious health issues on top of everything else we've dealt with. My wife has to have major surgery coming up at 5 a.m. Monday morning, and we've just been rolling with the punches here lately. So I really haven't had the mindset or the wherewithal to do a long processed video. And as most of you know, most of my videos are not long process anyway. But I will start doing some videos that I think will go hand in hand. And the other topics that I want to cover are substrate, filtration, fish, and plants. And I think that water, substrate, filtration, fish, and plants will give a fairly broad overview for someone who is a new fish keeper to begin to get a handle on what it is that they need to do. It was my intention to do substrates next because I think that's one of the things that most people that go out and buy a fish tank, the salesperson says, go pick you out some gravel. And what kind of gravel, what kind of substrate, and accompanied with what kind of filtration you have in a tank, that can be a serious issue above and beyond water itself. If you're not really sure of what it is that you're doing, of what you're getting into, of what that substrate is actually going to do to the water in your tank and to the fish in your tank. So I think that starting next week, we'll move on to substrate. And I hope you guys bring your questions if you have any, and your anecdotal information that you can offer to new fish keepers about substrate, about your experiences, and this can be anything from price to usability to reusability. There's just a myriad of different subjects that we can get into when it comes to substrate, and thereby the lack of substrate. A lot of tanks are bare bottom, so I think it behooves us to talk about why a lot of tanks are bare bottom, what situations are around where having a bare bottom tank is an effective way to deal with a certain issue, like breeding or even quarantine. There are a lot of places where the substrate or the lack thereof in a fish tank can be really important. All right, guys, I'm going to wean it off here. I look forward to seeing you guys next week, and I hope in some way I've given you some information that is helpful. If not, please let me know. Thumbs down will let me know that people are not liking this series or not liking how I handle it. This is an open forum and you are free to express yourself. You're free to express yourself by going away and never coming back if that's what you choose to do. That's not what I want you to do, but I can understand if people feel like I'm not giving them what they really need and that they think they can find it somewhere else. I will understand. Thank you, Candy. Yeah, it's going to be rough on her. She's going to be one sore puppy come Monday afternoon. All right, guys. Have a good rest of your weekend. Try to help a fish keeper, a new fish keeper, if you find one. If you're in the fish store and you meet somebody that looks like they're utterly lost, try to help those people out. Try to give them the benefit of your knowledge. You may just confuse them. You may make things worse, but you might make things better too. And you might make things better enough that that person ends up becoming another fish keeper. And we need more fish keepers in this world right now. All right. Good luck with your fish.